not secure. The greatest problem that you have right now is that existing cybersecurity regulations, frameworks, they're not in place in order to provide the appropriate guidance to the overall industry. The biggest challenge, in my opinion, is that the ship owners and operators, many of whom just don't believe that there is an actual threat from a cyber perspective to their organizations, and those that do often find out when it's too late. Cybersecurity begins at the top. It begins with the owners themselves. Companies, company owners, company operators, executives in these organizations, if they don't invest the appropriate resources or they don't fundamentally believe that their companies may be at risk to cyber threats, then it's only a matter of time before their organizations may be compromised or exploited for financial gain. The biggest problem with these companies is that cybersecurity cannot be solved with a single magic bullet. There is no one-stop solution in order to address the challenges around that. Therefore, what we recommend is that companies take a holistic look and they begin from the top down. And often that begins with maybe a cyber awareness briefing for the actual owners themselves. And then from there, a strategy can then be developed and an organization can take more of a holistic approach to managing cyber risk across their organization. Any vessel system, whether it's an ECDIS system or an engine control system, any platform that has a digital footprint, any platform that has software that interacts with it or manages it or facilitates communication with other systems is vulnerable, period, no exceptions. The best way for an organization to actually protect these systems is to take a broad-based approach at implementing cyber risk management across the entire organization, not just on the vessels themselves, but in the office environments as well. So for example, if you have intrusion detection systems within the organization, but you don't have certain practices or procedures in place, for example, a near-miss report, that mechanism can be adapted to facilitate near-miss reporting of cyber activities among the crew aboard vessels. So the best way to look at protecting what I would call cyberized systems would be to take an enterprise approach, look at the business practices, look at the technologies, look at the training, look at your controls that you have in place across not just the vessels but on the shore side as well. Take a strategic approach at managing cyber risk across the organization, not just looking at protecting a single vessel system or a vessel on its own with a technology as a standalone solution. So in my opinion, the best way for an organization to protect cyber-enabled systems aboard vessels is to look at all the systems aboard the vessels and to align the strategies and the controls and the processes, not just on the fleet, but with the office environment as well. In my opinion, any of the new smart technologies that are coming out today are vulnerable to cyber attack directly. One thing to keep in mind when organizations look at procuring digitized or digital-enabled systems or digitized solutions, platforms, they have to keep in mind that these are being provided by vendors and manufacturers where their main purpose is pushing product into the market. And often when the coding occurs in the development of these systems, mistakes occur because humans are usually the ones behind the coding activities. And so it's not unusual for errors to appear at a rate of almost 1 error per 1,000 lines of code. Or sorry, excuse me, up to 10 lines of error per 1,000 lines of code. And that's not often the case with the largest companies out there, like the Microsofts of the world, who have gotten much better at this, but they too also have mistakes in the code. So with smaller outfits that don't necessarily have the extraordinary capabilities of a Microsoft or an Apple or even a Google, mistakes invariably occur. So as a result, organizations have to manage the risks when these systems are deployed into their functional operating environments. So if you have an ECDIS system that's deployed upon a vessel, or if you have other types of technologies that are deployed in the office, you have to establish controls, business processes throughout the organization to accommodate for activities that may occur and result in vulnerabilities that could be exploited by threat actors in these environments as a result of those vulnerabilities. The best way, in my opinion, almost without exception, is training. Training, you cannot train enough. When I tell business owners that when we provide recommendations to senior leadership about where to invest their money first, training is almost always one of the top priorities within an organization. And I can tell you it's not just a one instance type activity with training. You have to continuously train not just your crews on board your vessels for cyber awareness, but also your shore-based staff and your executives. It's an across-the-board type proposition. So there are a lot of things to talk about when organizations should look at cyber risk management in the maritime domain. First thing I would recommend for business owners, ship owners, operators is that they should stop looking to the IMO to solve their cyber risk problem. The IMO is a regulatory body. It establishes frameworks for best practices and whatnot, but the IMO is not in the business of solving cyber risk. That is something that organizations must be aware of. It's like 30, 40 years ago, there weren't information technology departments. There's no regulatory regime around what I call IT. And so organizations, when they look at cyber risk, they have to understand it's not just something that they have to manage in order to address a regulatory requirement. If they wait for regulations, they will be not only behind the curve on where they need to be in terms of establishing best practices and technologies, but they will also be behind the curve from a regulatory perspective as well. So what do I mean by that? So when you look at complying with regulatory regimes, it's often taken as a once a year type activity, or maybe even 2 or 3 times a year activity if there are exercises or planning or tabletop exercises that may occur. Organizations can't take a checkbox-based approach to managing their cyber risk. It's not something that happens a couple times a year. It's something that has to actually be ingrained in the culture of the organization and throughout the entire organization. One of the things that I think is also a major challenge for maritime operators to understand is the distinction between the shore-based operating environments and how they're connected to the shipboard operating environments. Often you'll have senior leadership that will sit there and say, well, we're going to assess a vessel or we're going to assess an office. They are all under the same umbrella of the organization. They have to take an enterprise approach at understanding what I call their cyber ecosystem. And what do I mean by a cyber ecosystem? A cyber ecosystem is basically all the assets, all the platforms, all the processes that reside within an organization that affect your cyber behaviors, your cyber risk, all your cyber activities, right? So just the fact that we share emails between office and vessel environments, right there you have your connection. So looking at cyber risk in one area and not the other is a big mistake, and it leaves a gaping hole in the organization when they look at managing cyber risk. So how to go about doing that? The best way to go about doing that is to what I call establishing a cybersecurity capability maturity assessment. And what is that? That is basically an assessment of their organization's cybersecurity capabilities at that point in time. And that's for the vessels, it's also for the office environment. And so once leaders have a sense of what their cyber ecosystem is, only then can they figure out how to go forward in implementing a strategy that addresses all the technologies, all the business processes, the training requirements, the information sharing requirements. Information sharing is another area that I advocate heavily in, is basically establishing a means of communication, not just internal within the organization. And what I mean by that is beyond the individuals themselves who may be tasked with cyber risk management activities in the organization, which may be information technology people, it may be the chief security officer, but facilitating communication among all the different stakeholders within an organization, and also with local law enforcement and your national law enforcement bodies. So that's a big area that I emphasize a lot. So. All right. Looking ahead to the year 2020, I envision two extraordinary challenges in the maritime domain. The first is the rise of the industrial Internet of Things, and the second is the continuing role of the human in this environment. With the industrial Internet of Things, or the IIoT, that hyperconnectivity in this environment is going to drive extraordinary changes that will deliver performance efficiencies and operational efficiencies across the industry, both in the shipping sector and in the port sector in general. This is a world that is measurable. It's the world of ones and zeros. With the human, on the other hand, we're talking about a world that is affected and driven by behavior, by culture, by agendas, and with cyber threat actors, those agendas in many cases are nefarious in nature. Their agenda is to access the legitimate operations of shipping companies and to exploit those weaknesses, mostly for financial gain. The challenges in the maritime domain in general are going to be how to continuously train and improve and continue to improve the capabilities of the workforce in the year 2020, and to not just provide the capabilities and the knowledge and the expertise in order to how to manage and interact with these platforms and these data sets, but also how to operate and function in a way that is understanding and aware of the very cyber risks that could actually impact their business and themselves as individuals. After the terrorist events of 9/11, many companies and organizations spent a lot of money and resources on security technologies, on training, on processes, in order to address perceived threats to their organizations and their people. This is the world of the physical. It's the world of sensors, of things that can be perceived at a distance, in the world of the here and now. The challenge with cyber risk is that it challenges people's concepts of space, time, context, and attribution. We don't typically know who's attacking us. We don't know why they're doing it. We don't know the reasons behind it, and we don't even know when they actually performed the attack. This is probably the single greatest challenge in cyber risk today, and it's especially so with ship owners and operators. These people are typically what I call non-digital natives. They weren't born and raised in a world where the internet was available from the time of their birth, and as they were learning and growing and experiencing life. This is something that's been thrust upon them. They've had to learn it and understand it and adapt to it in ways that the younger generation they just assume it's part of their way of being. We see that with the rise of social media. We see that with the rise of mobile devices and the constant connectedness that we see everybody looking at their cell phones and their iPads and their laptops when on airplanes and airports and train stations. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. So the best way, in my opinion, is for ship owners to understand that they need to become aware of the threats against them. They need to understand how those threats can impact their business, and also why, as maritime transportation operators, they are a target for cyber threat actors. And assessing where they are in this world and their place within it as an organization, also as an individual, is critical for their long-term success. So when we look at the year 2020, I would encourage ship owners and operators to begin now, because it is about cultural change within the organization. And as we all know, cultural change doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that just happens with a snap of your fingers. And when you look at driving cyber risk management, you need to start doing it today. It's something that needs to begin happening today so that we can be prepared for the very changes and the continuing hyper-connectedness that's going to be thrust upon us, or I should say, is currently being thrust upon us, but will be even more so in the year 2020. So as we look ahead in the next few years, the changes and the cyber risk management activities that need to occur need to start today, not tomorrow, not next year, but today.